note what we're going to
I
say.
just pressed streaming.
And
Okay, we are live. I'll just wait for the camera to come on. And we are live.
we're live.
So there's a little
Amazing.
stream delay with it, so we'll be a couple of seconds ahead of people in real life. Okay.
Cool.
So I'll let you introduce yourself, Catherine, since this was your idea.
Well, I think it's welcome to Psychology Made Simple with me, Catherine. I'm a CBT therapist working in the NHS and privately. Jason, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yep, I am Jason. I'm also a qualified CBT therapist. I work in the NHS as well and also do some private work.
Thank you. And we've set up this channel to discuss all things psychology and mental health. And today we're going to be talking about how to navigate the, massive amount of mental health advice, available on social media at the moment. And the reason this came up was because when I recently set up my own personal TikTok account, I was really surprised how many people were offering advice, to others on how to manage their mental health, some of which you were qualified to do so, some of which you're advising from personal experience. I thought that would be a good topic for us today. So Jason, what do you think are the challenges faced by people when navigating all this advice on social media?
Yeah, so I think very similar to you, I've seen an array of different advice and opinions come out, some right, some not so much. And I think some of the challenges are essentially working out how, what's correct, what isn't, what's backed by the evidence, what's more pseudoscience, and what can be helpful, what can be harmful. It can be really difficult to determine what's between those things because there's a lot of different resources out there, so many different types of therapeutic models and ways you could support your mental health. And people do say it rather convincingly. They kind of talk about their own advice and opinions. And they do it with such conviction that it's hard not to. So an example of a video I've seen once is someone talking about OCD, and what they did was whenever leaving the house and locking the door, they would record themselves doing it as a way to make sure. And I remember seeing a lot of the comments from people saying, I suffer with OCD, this is a brilliant idea, why didn't I ever think of anything like this before? But then, as we know, as therapists and trained to work with people with OCD, that actually is perhaps one of the worst things you can do. What about yourself?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, what you've just said. And, to, like you say, to us, looking at something like that is almost horrifying, isn't it? Because you know that it reinforces the problem. But to someone who doesn't have that insight, it would reduce anxiety temporarily and it would make sense in that moment. And it would sound like a really good idea to other people who have similar problems. So I've had similar experiences, to you. I've definitely read some things that I've been quite surprised about. So things that obviously are more overtly harmful. So you do obviously see some people promoting self-harm, which is really shocking.
Mhm.
And actually, I think that's illegal now, or they've put something forward, haven't they? I think in Parliament for that. But mostly more subtle things, like, for example, encouraging kind of breathing exercises for things that it might not be as helpful for. So, for example, panic attacks, there's a lot of information out there on breathing to manage anxiety. And as we know, for certain problems, that's super helpful. But for certain mental health problems like panic disorder, actually breathing techniques or over focusing on breathing can be a safety behavior, and it can actually reinforce the problem and reinforce these ideas about not being able to breathe, or about suffocating, passing out, those types of things, if you weren't to focus on your breathing. So there just seems to be a real kind of cocktail of information out there, and I can kind of see how it could be so hard to navigate, for the average person consuming this media.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting thinking about that example you gave with the breathing and how people still suggest doing that, which is interesting because I hadn't heard that one before. But again, it kind of comes back to that idea of how concerning it has been. And I think the internet and social media has really offered great things to society, but at the same time, it is that kind of, there's a lot of false information out there. And I guess, how do you know who's right? Because I think one thing I'm conscious of is kind of suggesting this idea that you need to only listen to people who are trained to deal with it. But at the same time, because in all honesty, there are people who are trained that actually can sometimes still give bad advice. So it comes back to that thing question of Catherine, which is, how do you decide what's valid, what's reliable, what isn't?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think there are a few things to consider. So, first of all, who is offering the information, or who is offering the advice? And that typically is either maybe someone who has had experiences of mental health difficulties already and wants to kind of support other people. And I do think that advice is valid, but I think one thing viewers need to consider is whether it's applicable to their situation. So that's something to be aware of. Just because one thing's worked for someone else, it doesn't mean it's going to work for them. And secondly, is the person offering advice, if they're claiming to be an expert, if they're speaking very confidently about how to manage certain problems, are they qualified to offer that advice? And that can be very difficult to determine because not everyone has their qualifications on their social media account.
Yeah.
So some of us do. So, if someone was go on my Instagram profile, they would be able to, link to my website, and all my qualifications are on there. But it's not, I think, as obvious for other clinicians. And then we enter the whole, obviously, problem of certain, clinical terms not being protected. So people calling themselves therapists, or psychotherapists, and the people who are actually consuming that media have no way of actually knowing whether that is the case. So I think it can be really, really difficult. So actually looking out for evidence of credentials on social media accounts, I think, is really, really important. And in doubt, try to follow people who for a fact are qualified. So someone who springs to mind, who seems to be all over social media at the moment. I don't know if you're thinking what I'm thinking, but Dr. Julie,
the
psychologist.
I can't say I've heard of them.
So she is on Instagram and TikTok and Facebook, and I think she's a psychologist by trade, and that would be an example of someone whose content is very safe to consume. I think they're my kind of initial thoughts. But I wonder if maybe we can come up with some kind of top tips for kind of navigating mental health advice online together. So one's, I guess, credentials, isn't it? Oh, well, sorry.
Sorry to kind of, before going there was a thing you mentioned about kind of making sure that they are registered, they're accredited, they've got protected, because like you said, there's a lot of things that aren't protected titles. So, for example, we're both CBT therapists, but that's not an actual protected title. Neither is psychologist. Clinical psychologist, on the other hand, is. But even then, having to be careful, because I saw on Twitter the other day, there is what appears to be a psychologist who works in a private practice in a luxurious area in London, very expensive area where medical treatment is quite well known to happen over there,
Mm.
who on
Yeah.
their website and on their specific profile page on that website had the BABCP logo attached. And for those who don't
Mm.
know, the BABCP is where CBT therapists are typically accredited by. And to have that logo, you do need to be accredited. And well, Catherine, what do we mean by accreditation?
So with the BABCP, if you are either working towards or accredited by that board, you have reached a certain kind of level of training in that therapy modality. And to sustain accreditation, you have to go through a certain amount of continuing professional development each year to kind of demonstrate that you are working at a particular standard. So working with someone who is accredited is really important. So they haven't just, done their course and qualified. They have continued to develop their practice and demonstrate that to an accreditation board. So it's a really good way, I think, of identifying people, who practice at a particular level.
Right. And yeah, absolutely. And so that you would feel fairly certain and safe seeing that sort of accreditation attached to that person.
You would. I have a feeling you're going to say something about it, though.
Well, not necessarily anything against the accreditation, but actually the person who had it on their website was in fact lying. They are not accredited by the BABCP, and that was found out.
That's
What was interesting
awful.
as well is that their logo was actually outdated. So it was the old green logo, and I think they recently changed it to blue. Or was it the other way around? Should know this because it's on my website. But
Yeah.
they were able to use that, and they were called out on it. Fortunately, it's the green one. Sorry, so it was blue previously. I just checked. And yeah, so yeah, sorry, I lost my train of thought. But they had it, even though they're not accredited by that.
Yeah.
So
That's really cheeky, isn't it? And concerning, actually. And it makes you wonder how widespread that issue is.
absolutely. And I think it comes down to not always just checking has that person got the logo, but actually looking at other. Probably the best place to look is on the BABCP register. So for those who don't know, certain accreditation bodies like BABCP, or for counsellors BACP, they'll have a register which you can Google. If you just type BABCP register, go into the first link, and then you can actually type in the name of the therapist in question. And if they are accredited, that should come up. And if they're not, then you can perhaps move on to someone else. And I think it's really important to consider how necessary being accredited is, because that's offering a certain level of protection for you, the client, as well, or you seeking information from that person that this is someone who has met their criteria, is continuing to meet those standards, and if they fall short of it, won't be able to remain a member of that body. So yeah, I just wanted to add that before we kind of talked a little bit about the advice.
Sure. And I think it's really important. I think it's part of the top tips, isn't it, for navigating mental health advice on social media. If you can find, someone's accredited who's offering advice, it helps. It helps when actually deciding whether or not to continue consuming all that media that they're posting. But except for that, what are the kind of top tips we can give everyone for navigating mental health advice online? Because there is just so much, so many people giving advice, whether it's, professionals like you and I, or people who are not qualified to offer the advice but have experiences themselves that they want to share, which can be good, can't it? It's really helpful. It's really good for normalising mental health. But how can we kind of help people to navigate this safely?
I think first and foremost, going back to something you said earlier about how it's some advice is more helpful for others, I believe you mentioned. And I think 100%. sticking with that and thinking about, what's going to be good for you. Is this helpful for you? If it doesn't sound right and it sounds like it might be potentially more harmful, then do steer clear of that. And I think from there, if you're not sure, seeing what others are saying about it. Now, it's tricky because it does come down to, it is always going to come down to what is helpful for you isn't helpful for others. But also, as I'm saying that, I'm also thinking back to that video with the OCD, where actually that does seem helpful for people, but isn't. So I guess it comes down to the next important tip for me, which is to look out for, look into the evidence if you can. And I think that's easier said than done. It's quite, if you don't know how to look, where to look, it can be quite, it can feel quite inaccessible. So there are perhaps a variety of websites that I would recommend looking at first. NHS, the NHS website always being a key one. Catherine, any come to your mind?
I'm trying to think what's most accessible in terms of information, because if you're used to scrolling through research papers, you would obviously go on, Google Scholar, wouldn't you? Or any other of those kind of research paper searching platforms. But that isn't going to be accessible, is it?
No,
for kind of the average person consuming social media content.
I find it quite difficult.
Yeah.
Myself to always look up what studies say, and also you even then you need to know which study to look for, which type, because there can be really small scale studies that find out things, but actually there's still much more work to be done before you can consider that evidence based.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree.
I would definitely, I'd say there's perhaps no right or wrong order to go about this, but I would definitely look at websites like Mind, the NHS website, as two places to start looking. And I would then try and find someone who on social media, so that you mentioned someone who seems quite legit, has quite good knowledge, though, how do you determine what is good and what isn't good knowledge? And that's probably going to take a bit of time to find one for you. But also, I'd say if you are really struggling, the number one thing you can really do is speak to your GP. I'd probably say, above all else, if you're struggling with your mental health in any way, and even if it's not getting to the point where it's unbearable, because I think we're very good. Human beings are very good at waiting for things to get really bad before seeking help. But if you've been struggling for a while, don't think about resources. Don't think about the fact that others have it worse. Don't be afraid to kind of approach help. Now, unfortunately, I have heard stories where some GPs are more helpful than others. And it's the same with therapy. Some therapists will be more helpful than others. But you can go to your GP, or you can self-refer to your local IAPT service, where you can speak to a trained professional who is supervised by someone who has deeper knowledge, and they will kind of make sure that you'll be signposted or given the right type of therapy as well. So that's probably the best advice from me.
Yeah, I think just building on that, it's really important, isn't it, not to substitute seeking professional support with just advice on social media, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Because I think, sometimes the way the advice is given online, it's so convincing, isn't it? And it's important that we don't use that, instead of actually approaching your doctor to ask about what advice is available. So I think that is super important. And something that just kind of popped into my mind as well is I don't know about you, Jason, but I definitely find myself scrolling on social media quite a lot, even though I know it's not that good for me. It's really hard not to, isn't it, to consume so much of that media. And I think it can be really easy to fall into the trap of reading a lot of information about how to improve your mental health online and getting lots of ideas and actually substituting, going out the house and doing things, that like seeing friends, exercise that we know, for certain to be helpful with all this content. So I think that's a really easy trap to fall into. So I think that would be my next tip to, not substitute, really simple and easy, healthy activities that we know are good for our mental health for all of this, what is quite complex content that's telling us how to help ourselves.
Absolutely. And I think something I'm seeing more and more these days is that life is really difficult. No matter what age you are, if you're a teenager, you're an adult, life is quite complex at the moment, and things are seemingly only going to get tougher. So trying to be compassionate to ourselves, I think, is really important in terms of acknowledging that actually perhaps it's fairly understandable that we feel the way we do. And these are natural responses. I myself couldn't experience anxiety. I'm going through quite a lot of changes in my life at the moment, as Catherine knows. And understandably, I'm feeling quite anxious. And I think back to Paul Gilbert's model of compassion-focused therapy and just really thinking about the soothing element and how important really nurturing that soothing element is. And for those who don't know what I mean by that, I'm talking about doing things that just can help us feel good. And even though these are things that might not necessarily tackle the source of the problem for us, these are just things that can help calm ourselves down, slow the body down a bit. And those are going to be things like pets, being around loved ones. It can be opening up to them if you want, or not even necessarily having to talk to them about your difficulties, but just being around them and being in that moment with them. Those things which can seem so unimportant and usually are the first things we let go of are perhaps some of the most important things we should be clinging onto during our difficult times.
Yeah, I completely agree. But do you think we are self-soothing in other ways? Do you think we're turning to, social media and all this content online to self-soothe when we should be, engaging in more simple activities, like you say, spending time with pets, taking time out?
I think so. I think it's hard not to. We all have these devices now that can do so many great things. It's so easy to quickly go online, go on TikTok, go on Twitter, go on Facebook, Instagram, within seconds. And I think because of the nature of social media, it's fast, it's rapid, the content is quite short. It's easy to get hooked onto that. And I myself have, fallen into a trap with TikTok where I could easily spend an hour on TikTok and time has just gone. And because it is so addictive, there's this, 2-minute videos, not even a minute, 30-second videos. It makes you laugh, makes you think, and then you're on to the next one. So and I'm curious to know what this has done to us on a biological level in terms of how much we humans now really rely on rapid content, rapid information, and how much that might make it difficult for us to just sit with our thoughts a bit more, just be a bit more idle or bored.
It could be information overload, couldn't it? And actually, sometimes you can have too many options, can't you?
Mm-hmm.
And that can create a lot of confusion and uncertainty. If you're consuming a lot of content online, how do you know what is wrong? And how do you know what's right? And how do you know what's harmless? It's really, really hard. And I think, the world's complicated enough as it is. And there's so much pressure, isn't there, out there? And, if you've got all of that going on, and then on top of that, you've got all of this content, all of these people telling you all sorts of different things, a lot of confidence as well. How do you know what to do with that information? And I think when things feel so overwhelming and complex, when someone's telling you something that sounds so simple and they're saying it with so much confidence, you believe it, don't you? And I don't know about you, Jason, but sometimes if I'm on social media and I don't know, reading something to do with nutrition, sometimes the content or the person, offering the content says stuff with so much confidence, and they make so many promises, don't they, about what something can achieve. You believe it straight away. So I think that would probably be my final tip. Don't always believe everything you're told. Just because someone says something's helpful, it doesn't mean it is.
Absolutely. I do think it comes down to don't take everything with a pinch of salt, and do seek help from a professional if you are struggling, especially if you're thinking about those with OCD. I think 100% the best thing you can do is go and get professional support in the form of therapy. Same with PTSD, if you're struggling with depression. Because I think with depression, depression is an interesting one, because you've got these things we know help. If we think about commonly used technique in therapy, behavior activation, things like going outside, go exercising, doing more things has been proven to be helpful, and the evidence for it is really strong. But of course, that is easier said than done, and there are people who are depressed based on circumstances. And things like behavior activation won't necessarily address those, which I've sometimes seen people do feel quite dismissed when seeking therapy, being told to do these things, and then thinking, well, that's not the kind of the issue I'm facing. And I think it's really important to take away the fact that you're right, that isn't, and behavior activation, doing more things, going outside, isn't going to solve these external stressors. But it's a case of, I always think about the stress bucket. Things can be really tough.
I love the stress bucket.
So do I. Things can be really tough, and we might not necessarily be in full control of those stresses in our lives. But things like soothing, going out, being with friends, even though they won't solve the problem, those little moments can really help improve your well-being, just improve your resilience a bit. That makes it easy to cope with. Because I do work with people who are understandably depressed. They're going through really difficult times, and it's continuously making them feel worse. And I think it's important to acknowledge that, but also acknowledge the fact that, well, therapy isn't going to change that anyway. What therapy can do is help you either find ways out of it, if it's possible, or cope with it better. And that's kind of the thing. And we think about the state of the world at the moment with the rise of living costs, the war in Ukraine, global warming, the current issues within our politicians. It's understandable to feel really stressed out and down and anxious, but we have to kind of, where possible, just shift our focus a little bit to do things that can ground us in everyday life. And I do think if you are ever feeling dismissed, do know that we know that it's not nice, it's not easy to hear, but this is about trying to put you in control during a time where perhaps you have no control.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And something that's just popped into my mind is this idea of actually, validating your emotions. And I feel that there's quite a lot of pressure, isn't there, to fix things? And I know that we as CBT therapists, we like to fix things, don't we? And we like to give people lots of techniques they can use to manage how they feel. And although that is super helpful, sometimes you do just have to acknowledge how you feel and sit with it for a bit, and don't feel pressurized to do anything straight away. And I think kind of going back to this kind of tsunami of content, coming towards us about how to manage our mental health, sometimes it's important just to pause and think about how you feel rather than going straight to trying to problem solve that, because you can end up kind of taking advice or the wrong advice rather than kind of pausing and thinking what's actually going to be most helpful.
Absolutely. I think that's so key. Going back to Paul Gilbert's model there with compassion focused therapy, for those who don't know, it suggests that we all have three systems: drive, fret, and soothe. Fret, that's our anxiety, that's the alarm systems, that's activated whenever we're in danger or we're worrying about something, or even if we're feeling rejected. Then you've got your drive, that's our kind of motivator, that's what motivates us to seek things out: achievement, rewards, food, those things. And then the soothe, which I mentioned earlier, and that there is just to kind of put a bit of a break on things. And often in that model, soothe is the first neglected, and what happens is that only the drive and the fret are given any attention, and it creates a fret drive system where you use your drive in order to problem solve the thing causing you fret, but it can be done so out of desperation. So, for example, falling behind on work, got a lot of late projects, so I'm going to stay behind every night, skip over my lunch break, and just work longer and longer hours to get it met. And that might seem helpful in the short term, but in the long term, what does that take away from you in terms of your ability to relax, that work-life balance, your well-being? Does it make you less efficient over time? Does it mean where you're so tired you might make more mistakes and become more frustrated and flustered? And so it's so important to use the soothe as a break. And I like to think of it as they all work together, in the sense that your fret system will make you aware of the problems, and your soothe system will just take that fret, take a step back from it and think about, right, what can I do about this? And then you bring that to the drive, which then puts that plan into action, as opposed to fret action. It becomes fret plan action. And that means you can make decisions that are more rational, more logical. And I think it's important that even us as therapists rely on that from time to time. We get flustered, we get overwhelmed. And to remember that going to therapy or anything, the goal is never to eliminate emotions. We can't. We all get anxious, we all get depressed, we all get angry. But it's how we respond to those that's key. So, and I just want to tie that in with the point you made about just being able to acknowledge and sit with those emotions.
Yeah, it's so important. And, it's okay to have a bad day. Just because you're feeling depressed or feeling anxious, that doesn't mean that you have to get rid of those emotions straight away. It's important to, pause, reflect on why that's happened, and think about the soothing, prior to taking action, like you were saying. And we can apply that, can't we, to kind of how to navigate support online as well.
Yeah. And I think, sorry, I just wanted to quickly say, I think it comes down to something I experienced as a therapist and used to struggle with early on in my career, was this feeling that when someone does bring me something catastrophic has happened, I would want to swing into action and think, right, how can we make this person feel better? What can we do about it? And actually, there wasn't always something practical that we could do. So if someone has a relationship breakdown, there's nothing you can do or say that's going to make them feel better immediately. It's understandable. Or a bereavement, you're going to feel sad, and time is the healer here. And so the best thing you can do is just, I can do in those situations, is just acknowledge and talk through that with them, let them process that. And so if you are struggling with things, don't repress it, don't push it away, don't try and ignore it. Talk it through with someone you can trust. Sorry, Catherine, you were going to bring on a new topic.
I was just going to say, should we just really briefly summarise our kind of top tips for navigating mental health? Because I was making some notes as we were talking. Just so if anyone's listening or watching this back, they can just think about it all together. But we've got, I guess, what we've just been speaking about, haven't we? So validating emotions. Just because you're feeling bad or you're feeling anxious doesn't mean that you have to do something about it straight away. Pause, have a think about why that is, and then think about what's going to be most helpful after you've applied the Soothe system. I think second is, who is offering the advice online? Can you check whether that person is qualified or accredited? And if the person who's offering the content is talking about their own personal experience, that's really validating. That's fantastic that they're sharing, but is that applicable to you and your situation? Don't believe everything you hear. I think we're all very guilty of that, and myself included. But just because someone says it with confidence, it doesn't mean it's fact or there's any research that supports it. I think one of my favourite ones, don't use content as a substitute to engaging in kind of day-to-day activities that we know are helpful. So things like getting out the house, doing some exercise, seeing friends, those types of things are actually probably going to have a kind of a more positive effect on your mental health than consuming all of this content that's kind of teaching you how to look after yourself. Is it safe? Is the advice being offered actually harmful in some way? Or is it helpful? So that goes back to what you were saying, Jason, with the OCD example. Actually what's being recommended, is that something that's going to actually solve the problem in the long run, or is it something that's going to make it worse in the long run but give you that sense of relief in the short term? So I think that was all of our kind of tips, wasn't it? Is there anything I've missed?
No, I think you covered most of it. I would say I had a thought in my mind about. There were two things. I think wanted to really express that we're not by any means saying that because we're trained, only our advice is applicable and worth knowing, but actually that we're just saying to be careful because there are people who find these hacks that work for them or seemingly might appear to work for them, enough so that they'll talk about it and share that widely, but knowing that actually, do they know? What is their experience? What is their training? And by experience, I mean, so for example, many NHS services will work with experts by experiences. These are people who've had therapy before, who've gone through the system. And I would say I would trust their input quite a bit. And that's because where they've gone through the system, they would have been trained in a sense in terms of how to share information safely, what information to share, as opposed to kind of insisting that their methods work. Whereas someone who perhaps, hasn't ever gone through the system might share something that works, but they've never checked that out with someone. They've never talked about it. And I want to briefly explain why the one with OCD perhaps concerns me, just because I think it's important. We don't assume. People don't know.
Yeah,
but we know that with OCD, you have those obsessive thoughts. Those are usually those intrusive thoughts people experience. That if they, for example, locking the door, have I locked it? I haven't locked it. I need to go and check it. Those thoughts are understandably going to make anyone doubt themselves, going to make themselves feel anxious, and that's going to prompt anyone really to go and check, and that creates that feedback loop of going, checking. Because otherwise, if they don't check, someone's going to break in, and it will be their fault. Something like that. Now, that's where the kind of compulsive element in OCD comes in. The kind of I need to check, and then you go and check the door. And in CBT, a phrase we often use is safety-seeking behaviours, and these are essentially a range of things that we all do when anxious, with the idea of trying to reduce that feeling. So, for example, going back to check that the door is locked is your attempt to make sure it's locked. therefore getting rid of that feeling and those thoughts. Another example might be, say, someone with social anxiety will drink alcohol because it will improve their confidence. And what I think is important is when we talk about safety-seeking behaviours, it's not the behaviour itself that makes it one, it's the reasons you do it. So if you're out with friends and you're drinking because everyone else is drinking and you want to drink, that's fine. But if you're drinking because if you don't drink, you're not going to be confident enough and then you're going to have to leave early, that is a safety behaviour. Going back to this idea of kind of taking a video, that itself again is a safety behaviour. That's replacing one with another. And what that does is, we know with safety behaviours, is that they work in the short term. But in the long term, it just builds this reliance, doesn't it, Catherine? You just rely on it too much. And OCD in particular is almost like an infection where it spreads. So you might have found this momentary solution with taking a video, but soon enough, that's not going to be enough anymore. Then you'll have to do something else. It might be take another video. How do you know that video isn't old? Check the date, keep checking the video, keep checking the recording, pause, take more pictures. After an hour, it could get worse, but it won't ever be enough. And that's because OCD in particular is like a bully and it's never satisfied. And so that's why I cringed when I saw that video, because it just doesn't help. It just feeds into the problem that will just get worse later on. And that's why one of the core things we would do in CBT is eliminate the safety behaviours so that you don't have to rely on anything. And I think that's it, because you mentioned earlier this idea of tools and techniques, didn't you, Kath? And I think CBT is quite well renowned for having tools and techniques, but I think it's important to know that CBT gives these tools and techniques as an illustrative way of helping you overcome your problems. But the idea is that you never have to rely on these for the rest of your life. So, for example, what's an example of this? We could say behavioural activation with the diary, maybe.
Yeah, or even an experiment. Maybe going back to your OCD example, doing an experiment to test out. Not taking a video or a photo to find out. What really happens when they don't do that. The idea is they won't be having to test that out in the long run, because they'll obviously stop taking the photos. So you're using the technique as a means to an end to feel better, aren't you?
And what I always tell my clients is that these tools it's not the intervention, it's not the therapy. This is just it's just a way to illustrate what you should be doing, help increase that learning, help increase the potential gains. So like writing things down, planning things, setting up these experiments. The log. So with the experiments, we create a log, don't we? We kind of write out what we're testing, what we think is going to happen, what we're going to do, like how we're going to test it, and what the outcome was. The idea isn't that piece of paper is the therapy. The therapy is you testing it out and seeing for yourself. And once you've done it, as Catherine mentioned, you wouldn't have to do it again for the rest of your life. You don't have to keep setting these experiments up. Or with activity schedule, where you plan a diary of the activities you're going to do. If you don't like living by a diary, most people don't, the idea isn't that you're going to live by a diary for the rest of your life. It's just a way to help you plan and improve your motivation to do things. As the motivation comes back, you'll be doing those things without a diary. So I think that's kind of, in my view, the difference between a safety behaviour and the tools we teach in CBT, is that the CBT aren't replacing safety behaviours with new safety behaviours. These are just temporary things that you do in order to get to a point where you don't need anything.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of explaining it. You're comparing the safety behaviours to the techniques. One that is something you're going to have to keep doing in order to manage your anxiety forevermore. The other is a means to an end, to feeling better. And although it might temporarily make you feel a bit anxious to change things up, take a bit of a risk, in the long run, actually not having to use safety behaviours is going to be much more beneficial for your anxiety.
Absolutely. Right.
Okay. So I think last question for us today. So, and it does kind of follow on from what we've been talking about. And I think we've touched on it already, but When should we be seeking professional support rather than just consuming advice online? And I think we already said it's important if you kind of struggling to speak with your GP, but do you think there is a point at which you should be seeking professional advice?
Yeah, so I don't think personally it's so entirely black or white. Um, I think it only you know. Something I often tell the clients I work with is they are the experts of themselves, and I think that's true in all cases. You are the
Mm.
expert of yourself. You know what works best, and if you are struggling, don't delay. That said, you know, when would I really go? Well, I think I would go if the issues I was having with were happening more days than not, and were going on for quite a while, and couldn't be attributed to something understandable. So, for example, just to kind of highlight, I'm currently in the process of buying a home and moving. That's stressful, and I've had days where I felt quite anxious and on edge. But to me, I'm managing that because I'm still going out and seeing friends, talking about it with people, trying to live my life. It's not really impacting my life day to day, but I still feel that way. But also, I can attribute that to something quite understandable, in my opinion, at least. But if you are going through something that doesn't look like it's going to end anytime soon, it you are having days where it impacts you more often than not. It is getting in the way of how you live your life. Then that would be the point in which I would go and get support.
Yeah, and that was kind of one word that kind of popped into my mind, the level of impact that the kind of the mental health difficulties are having on your life as a kind of a key indicator of when to actually seek professional support. And I think right actually at the beginning of this, you said to me about how we all quite often leave things to get really bad before we go and get support. I think that comes on to kind of one of my other points, kind of about when to get professional support over just kind of looking for advice online. Um, that being, oh, I've lost my train of thought. What was I going to say? I'll come back to it.
Yeah, yeah. So,
I'll
but
come
to
back to it.
maybe sum up my point a bit because I
Yeah,
went on a little bit, and hopefully that will give you the
yeah.
time you need. But
Thank you. Thank you.
I think, yeah, so you know yourself is point one of what I said. Point two is it getting in the way of how you live your life day to day? Is it taking the
Yeah,
fun out of it? Is it taking the enjoyment? Has it meant that you aren't getting on with your day to day? And is the source of the issue, whether it's external stressor or, something that's going to happen for quite some time, that it isn't going to end anytime soon, or there isn't perhaps even in your view at least, an understandable kind of reason as to what's making you feel this way. You just feel this way.
yeah, yeah. I agree. And it's just popped into my mind now. I
Right.
think I'm so tired, so I did a long run this morning. I think prevention. So just following on from what you were saying earlier about how we all leave it to get really bad before we get support. Actually, accessing support when the problem isn't that bad is important because it's also going to help you to, I think, get the most out of therapy. If you're feeling really, really depressed or really, really anxious, it can sometimes feel quite difficult, can't it, to actually kind of engage with the support. So if you're noticing that things are getting worse, but they're not at their worst yet, that can be a good point to go as a kind of a preventative strategy of things getting worse rather than waiting till you're at rock bottom, which I think we all do sometimes, don't we?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really
Yeah.
important to do that as soon as possible because one of the unfortunate realities is wait times.
Mm.
Um, and unfortunately, and it really breaks my heart each time, whenever I'm speaking to someone who's just referred into the service, and you can tell they need the help now, and having to tell them that there's going to be a wait is one of the worst parts of the job because you can see they need it now, and they're telling you they need it now, and it's a case of, is it so severe they need to go to a type of NHS service that offers more intensive support than us? Possibly, but A, will they see them? And B, they have their own wait times, perhaps even longer than ours, and we don't know. It's
Yeah.
it's one of the worst things. So I would honestly, if you really are getting to that point and you think it's going to get worse before it gets better, that is the point in which you should immediately refer yourself. Definitely, because what will happen then is, otherwise, if you go at that breaking point, that crisis point, you're going to be stuck on a wait list, and some are really atrocious, I can tell you.
Yeah, they are very long, aren't they?
Unless you're
so
in a
actually,
position of
yeah.
private, you can afford private, which isn't accessible to everyone.
No, it's not. And actually, I think sometimes private therapists have quite long waits as well, don't they? So actually getting yourself on a waiting list sooner rather than later is going to be more helpful, isn't it? Because it might, it buys you a few months, doesn't it, to actually try and work on the problem independently until you can see someone, rather than waiting till you're at kind of breaking point and then getting support when you're absolutely desperate for it and having to then wait, for 3 to 6 months for support, sometimes longer, as we know.
Absolutely.
So
that does give me
really
a topic for next time: how to pick how to pick the right therapist for you, and how to what to do if you don't like the therapist you have.
Yeah, it's a bit of window shopping, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I think that is.
We'll talk a little bit. Let's save that one for next time.
That's a good idea. Yes, I'll make a note of that. Well. Sounds good.
Of course, if people do have ideas, if they pop it in the comments on YouTube, we'll check it out, and that'll be really helpful as well to kind of because I think the purpose of this is to try and make all this advice accessible, share what we know, share what we experienced, and just to kind of give people a different insight into mental health that they might not be privy to.
Yeah, absolutely. So any kind of comments or input, welcome. We'd really appreciate that. And we will be back with more discussions. So on interesting topics.
Are we going to put a date to that so people can know?
Probably. What do you think? What's realistic for us with our schedules?
Yeah, that's hard to say because this is only a starting point. If it kicks off and we can fit it in, then we'll make it more regular. But for now, we're looking at maybe once a month, aren't we?
Yeah, we are. So actually, we'd be looking at Sunday the 18th, wouldn't we?
Possibly,
of September, which is like approximately a month. So should we at probably 5 o'clock again?
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, I think that'll probably work best. 5 o'clock the 18th. We can talk a little bit about we can talk about that next topic unless something else comes up as well. And people have any other advice.
Sounds like a plan.
Great. So
amazing.
Well, this was obviously the first one, so obviously things are going to be a bit rusty on our parts, but we'll keep getting better. This was mostly a trial for now, but we'll keep improving as we go along.
We will. Fingers crossed.
And hopefully
I won't go blank again.
Yeah, hopefully. And hopefully, we can bring on some guests as well.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
To talk about things. Because I've got, just to kind of highlight a few ideas I've got. One is talking about, issues within therapy, issues within mental health is another area. Navigating a career in mental health.
Yeah, that would be great, because I think both you and I, we've spoken about careers a lot, haven't we, over the years, and there's no really right or wrong route to go down, isn't there?
No, absolutely.
Is there? So that's a great topic.
Just to highlight to everyone, so I'm Catherine specialises in in CBT, but also nutrition is quite an area of interest for her. So, and that's quite topical because I think it was a few months ago, we had that controversial update where menus now display calories, don't they?
Oh gosh, don't get me onto that topic.
So, there'll be certainly a lot of things around nutrition, because that's very much linked with mental health, weight, nutrition, your image, eating disorders. That's very much, and that's something Catherine has a special interest in. I'm also going to be doing the clinical doctorate training, so have a lot to share there as well, hopefully. As well, but yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
Okay, take care and have a good night, everyone.
Bye. Have a good evening.
Just okay, I've finished.